How's it going, crypto community? This is Jade Martian, back with the final part of the Chris Larson and Stephen Thomas talk at Google. If you are new to this series, please be sure to go back into my playlist in the deep dives or the talk at Google to start this series from the beginning. Otherwise, if you haven't already, why haven't you? Please hit that subscribe button, join the XRP Martian group, and also hit that like since you've obviously watched through this series at this point and found it deeply interesting. I hope that you will also ring that bell up in the corner so that you can be notified of my next deep dive series. So with all the plugging out of the way, let's jump right into this and finish this talk.
Thank you guys for coming to speak today. I'm kind of curious to learn more about how you might prevent money laundering and companies that participate in, like the payday loan type companies from coming on the system that exploit people financially. I'm interested to learn more about that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, I mean, I think we really try to focus on, kind of the bottom of the payment stack, so kind of on the infrastructure part of it. Again, a reason for that is that a lot of the things that prevent bad things from happening are kind of top of the stack. And a lot of that actually doesn't need to be reinvented, right? And the way we kind of think of it is like, let's focus on what's really changing. And we think this is the interoperability. It's the idea of a digital asset with no counterparty that can be sent anywhere in the world that's neutral. So those are the things I think we can change, and then piggyback off of this is what we like, kind of the enterprise focus now is for that as that first beachhead. Piggyback off of what already exists for hundreds of millions, of people. The other thing I would say is that if this Internet of Value becomes a reality, I think the prevention of things like payday lending, obviously that has to be regulated. That's a big part of it at every level. But the other big thing to what Stefan mentioned before is sort of the commoditization of reach. If you have that, you suddenly now, every market has way more competitors for financial products. And it was something we saw at Prosper and Elon we got frustrated with because we were kind of US only. You couldn't transport it to another market because you were in another network, right? This future vision, I think, is that the world is one big financial supermarket, and everybody's competing in every market. I think that goes a long way, but you still need all the other, kind of regulatory components pretty much existing. Some may go away, but I'd say probably most of them don't. I don't know what you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think like with you mentioned anti-money laundering. I think there's sort of a long list of things that are actually completely separate issues, right? There's sort of consumer risk, there is anti-money laundering, there is anti-terrorism, finance. Like there's all kinds of different things that you have to think about when you're building a payment system. And so if you have a stack like this, they'll fit in different parts of the stack. Like for instance, consumer protection, that would fit in the application layer. So if you're building an application where consumers are sending money, you have to think about how to protect those consumers from sending it to the wrong people. If you think about risk, like counterparty risk, that would fit in the sort of the ledger layer, right? So you have a counterparty, they settle with you on a certain schedule. How do you make sure they actually settle with you? So there are a myriad of things to think about. I think that it's kind of illusory for us to come up with all the solutions. I think we're trying to be thoughtful in terms of like getting it to a point where we can start experimenting with it and kind of get more experience with it. But that's going to require sort of a commercialization of the technology to really think about all of those use cases. And I would also highlight that Ripple has a commercial stack and a commercial feature set, and that is very much like Chris said, kind of riding within the existing regulatory framework. And then we have the open protocols, which are maybe a little bit more forward-looking, and I think some of those questions are more difficult there. So what you saw us present today is the more forward-looking stuff. So I think some of those questions are still open there.
Thank you very much.
So yeah, there you have it. As far as does Ripple have any intention of replacing these financial institutions? No, not exactly. They believe that their technology is meant to essentially bring the enforcement that is meant for the top down upon all equally, and that way creating as many have heard the term being used by President Trump, a fair playing field, right? That's what this represents, is a fair playing field, and as Chris Larson said, a global shopping mall, or whatever phrase he used to describe that basically everybody's gonna come in and compete in the same space through this new internet of value, that this internet of things that they're developing. So let's go right back into it, because we still have about 8 minutes and I don't want to be too long-winded.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. So since the tech is currency agnostic, what would be the incentive to choose XRP over fiat or any other cryptocurrency?
So this is where I'd almost love to ask my colleague up on stage, because we have our team who's actually trying to integrate with these different digital assets and different payment systems, and it's just many orders of magnitude of difference between XRP and, let's say, Bitcoin, and still several orders of magnitude between XRP and something like Litecoin, which is known as a more efficient sort of asset, and it's just a pleasure to work with, and part of it is it's been designed for that, right? Like, it's been designed to be used as the settlement asset in Interledger, and so has a lot of functionality like payment channels built in a certain way that are incredibly efficient for this particular use case. And so I think the main answer is right now it's just the best thing to use. Like, we talk to people, hey, let's set up a connector. Well, what do we peer with? Well, we could use Litecoin, or we could use XRP, but XRP will just be cheaper, so let's use XRP. And so I think as much, to the extent that these connectors are going to be competing with each other and they're trying to think about their margins, XRP is just going to look like a very good option for them.
Yeah, in this world, you'll need some digital asset that is super fast, super cheap, endlessly scalable. That will serve the world very well, right? Better than, let's say, using a dollar or using a euro, right? Something that is neutral to any network. So we're absolutely confident that some digital asset will be a key part of this internet of value, but we think that sort of fast, cost and scalability are going to be those key things, and that's what's going to drive the liquidity that's going to make these things really useful.
Yeah, and XRP is not static either. It's like we're constantly thinking about how to help improve it. There's a community out there that's thinking about how to improve it. So you can expect that it will get better as well as time goes on.
Final question?
Well, before you ask this final question, let's just touch on that, right? Because as many people worry, and as we touched upon in, I think it was part 6, maybe 5, when we were going over the actual Codius and how it would charge, and then we were talking, at the beginning of that video about the fact that the ledger layer doesn't need to be fast, it just needs to be, efficient and cheap, whatever is the best option. And because of how Ripple's developed, XRP, like Stefan just pointed out, or I think as Chris just pointed out rather, that due to its speed and cheapness, it's just gonna be the pick. It's gonna be the one that everybody goes to just because. And due to the unfortunate downside to Bitcoin not scaling properly, it just won't be able to compete. Especially once you start putting real liquidity into Bitcoin and real liquidity into XRP. XRP is actually more expensive to use at these lower prices than it will be at its higher values. That's a direct quote, I believe, from Brad Garlinghouse. It's either that or David Schwartz, one of those two. I don't believe it's either the two on stage right now that I've heard it from, but I've definitely heard that from one of the team members. And it's important to keep in mind where these technologies are, not only in 2018, but where they are now, right? XRP's just gotten, XRP's about 4 times, the actual asset itself is several times faster. I think it's about 4 times faster now than it was in February of 2018. And Bitcoin, it hasn't sped up at all. It's the same. Whatever it is, 16 transactions per second, right? It's garbage. It's garbage, guys. I'm sorry. It's just, the Lightning Network team, they screwed Bitcoin because they didn't scale it. They wanted Bitcoin to stay at its current hash rate to preserve Satoshi's vision, even though apparently that didn't work because Craig Wright, aka wannabe Satoshi's, out there now saying that it wasn't the Bitcoin wasn't the real Bitcoin anymore. So we gotta go back. We gotta go back to version 1 because apparently there was nothing wrong with version 1. That's why it was changed in the first place, right? Because people wanted to ruin a good thing. Anyways, let's see what this gentleman's question is, and we can finish this up, right?
Hi. So I was listening in the very beginning of your presentation about how you think XRP is better over Bitcoin, in the sense that Bitcoin is a lot slower, a lot more expensive. But it is there for a reason, right? Because it requires like at least 6 confirmation across the network in order for a transaction to happen, and that is there in order to address the double spending problem. So I was just curious, like in your own words, how does that XRP address the double spend problem if it's just a confirmation between the 2 nodes?
Yeah. So if you're not technical, please, do something else for a little bit. Because there's no way to answer that question without getting into some of the technology. So Bitcoin uses a consensus process, which is essentially based around the assumption that a majority of hashing power will never be held by a coordinated malicious attacker. And so if you're watching what the majority of hashing power is doing, you'll tend to be on a state of the network that is reasonable and doesn't contain reverted transactions and so on. However, the protocol as such does allow rollbacks, right? So you can, if somebody else presents you with a chain that's longer, has more hashing power behind it, you will roll back your transactions and switch to that. And I know that because I was one of the first people to implement a full node Bitcoin reimplementation from scratch. So I wrote that code, and it's very complex, annoying code to write, so I will remember that forever. On the Ripple side, such code does not exist. There's no way to roll back the network. Now, how is that possible? Well, the way that Ripple works is, as I mentioned before, the users select these validators, and then we essentially use that input as an input to sort of an algorithm where we look at the graph of what people selected, and then we run a consensus on validators that are central to that graph, or like that are highly trusted within that graph. And so it's sort of this 2-step process. And what that means is that when the first step is complete and you have identified which validators you're looking for, you don't have to worry about there being like more hashing power just over the horizon. Like once you hear from the validators that you've identified as being the ones that are validating, or like the ones that you're listening to, then you don't have to worry about some other validator coming in later saying like, no, actually we decided this, you just didn't hear about it yet. And so there's no need to roll back or to rewrite history. Once validators have committed to a decision, they can't change their minds essentially. And so that has a couple of impacts, or like a couple of ways that the protocol is different because of that. Number one, you only have to wait for one confirmation. You wouldn't wait for multiple confirmations because validators can't change their mind. You can't roll back, so there's no probabilistic aspect to it. Number two is we can process, or we can create blocks on a cadence, so we can create blocks on like a fixed interval, as opposed to a random interval like Bitcoin, where blocks can come out very close together, or there could be no block for a long time. Because we know which validators are supposed to generate blocks, they can generate them on that cadence. And then finally, I think, did I cover everything?
Yeah.
Yeah, whatever. There's a really good talk on, I shouldn't call it really good, but there's a talk by myself on consensus that you can find out from the Consensus 2017 conference, where I go into a little bit more detail. And I'm also happy to like talk to you afterwards, but that's kind of the high level, quick description.
Cool. Chris. Guys, thank you so much for coming. Do you have any final statements, or do you want to tell people how they can get involved in the Ripple community at all?
Yeah, so for Interledger, there's interledger.org, which at the time of recording is horribly out of date, but hopefully by next week should be showing all the latest greatest stuff. There's a community group at the W3C called the Interledger Community Group that's open to anyone to just register. We have a mailing list where we discuss how all these protocols work together. All the code for the demos and everything, you can find that on github.com/interledger and /interledger.js. And then for Ripple, ripple.com. If you're a bank, let us know. Reach out if you're a payment provider. Maybe if you work for Google Payments or anything like that, let us know. And then there's another project which we didn't really mention today, but that's also was also used in the demo in the background, which is called Codia. So that's basically the hosting system that's paid with Interledger, and we uploaded the website to it. There's a lot of cool use cases around hosting, if you think about serverless hosting, et cetera. So if you're into that, there's codius.org as well, codius.org.
Awesome. Chris, Stefan, thank you so much for coming.
Thanks.
Really,
So there you go, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed this final part involving the last of the Q&A, where we got a nice little description at the end from Stefan about how XRP's ledger system, its anti-double spend system, compares to Bitcoin's, how proof of work matches up against Ripple or XRP's consensus algorithm. And I guess the simplest way to really sum up what he had said for anybody that didn't really understand is Bitcoin requires multiple validators to to come to consensus on a payment being processed, whereas RippleNet, it's simply the system picks, the consensus model picks a validator nearest or most that can most efficiently perform that equation to verify that transaction, and then that is carried over, right? So awesome talk, plenty of cool information here, especially for people that are still just getting their feet wet, learning a little bit about Ripple. This is actually really good talk for people who don't know a lot really about what's going on, because they touched on basically everything, and they both Chris and Stefan did a great job of breaking down some of the more complex things, and hopefully what they got a little bit technical and jargony on, I was able to help provide clarity with, basically just normal English, right? So as always, if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to hit that like. If you're new, why haven't you hit that subscribe button yet? And also be sure to ring that bell so you can stay up to date with all my latest content. As always, I've been Jade, you've been watching The Martian Report, and I can't wait to see all of you, my XRP Martians, in the next video on Mars.